Liberal reporter thought he could corner Park Jungkook, but he never expected him to turn the tables. The lights in the Seoul studio burned bright, reflecting off the sleek black desk where Kim Seokjin sat, reviewing his notes for the third time. He wasn't just any journalist. He was a veteran of the game, known for his aggressive questioning and the way he could make even the most seasoned idols and public figures stumble. He had built his career on it, expose the contradictions, unravel the talking points, leave them scrambling. That was his strategy, and tonight he had his sights set on Park Jungkook. Jungkook had been making waves. Young, confident, and completely unshaken by the relentless media storm that followed him. He was a rising star in the entertainment industry, but to Seokjin, he was an opportunity, a chance to prove once again that the polished narratives of celebrities didn't hold up under real scrutiny. His producers had fed him everything he needed. Clips of Jungkook's past interviews, social media posts, every stance he had taken. He had his angles mapped out. Challenge him on his music, corner him on his public image, push him until he tripped over his own words. It had worked before. The control room buzzed with energy. Producers adjusted camera angles. A floor manager gave countdown signals. And in the wings, a makeup artist dabbed at Seokjin's forehead one last time. He barely acknowledged it. His focus was locked on the chair across from him, the one Jungkook would soon occupy. He's not ready for this, Seokjin muttered under his breath, rolling his pen between his fingers. He's never faced someone like me. A deep breath. The theme music kicked in, signaling the start of the segment. The screen behind him displayed the bold, capitalized title, Exposing the Idol, an unscripted interview with Park Jungkook. The camera light blinked red. It was showtime, but then something shifted. The moment Jungkook walked onto the set, something changed. Seokjin expected nerves, maybe a flicker of hesitation in his eyes, a rigid stance that betrayed unease. But instead, Jungkook moved with the kind of confidence that caught him off guard. Shoulders back, head high, he slid into his chair like he had done this 1,000 times before. No fidgeting, no awkward glances toward the cameras. He offered a polite nod, crossing his legs as he rested his hands on the table. Waiting, Seokjin's usual smirk flickered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. He still had control. Jungkook, thanks for being here, he began, his voice even professional. Thanks for having me, Seokjin SSI. Jungkook replied smoothly, his tone unreadable. The producers had lined up a segment full of hard-hitting questions, each one designed to force a defensive response. Seokjin wasted no time. You've positioned yourself as a fresh voice in the music industry, he started, eyes scanning his notes. But a lot of people say that you're simply repackaging the same old idol image with a younger face. What do you say to those critics who believe you're just carrying the same old industry formula? A classic opening move: frame him as a puppet, force him to prove otherwise, make him scramble. But Jungkook didn't blink. He tilted his head slightly, as if he had already anticipated the question. It's interesting how when young artists rise in the industry, they're called innovators, he said, his voice calm but sharp. But when a young idol does, they're accused of just being a product of the system. Seems like a bit of a double standard, don't you think? The response was so fast, so sharp, that Seokjin hesitated for a fraction of a second. He wasn't used to being thrown off balance this early. He adjusted, shifting gears. Keep pressing. That's not what I'm saying, Seokjin countered smoothly. But let's talk about your music. You've been vocal about your creative process, yet many fans feel your recent work lacks originality. Why should they listen to someone who's arguing against the very trends they love? Another trap: make him seem out of touch with his own audience. But again, Jungkook didn't flinch. Fans don't just support music because it's trendy, he said, leaning forward slightly. They support what resonates with them. And if you look at the charts, you'll see that my music connects because it's authentic, not because it follows a formula. Fans deserve real artistry, not just recycled trends. Minjun tightened his grip on his pen. The audience couldn't see it, but he could feel control slipping. Not completely, not yet, but the dynamic wasn't playing out the way he had planned. He glanced at the screen in front of him. The live comments were already flooding in. Some viewers were nodding along with him, but others were clearly engaging with Jungkook's arguments. That was a problem. He wasn't supposed to be winning people over. But Minjun wasn't done yet. He still had tricks up his sleeve. Minjun forced a quick smile, a practiced move to mask the slight miscalculation in his opening attack. This wasn't the first time an interview had pushed back, but something about Jungkook's approach felt different. He wasn't defensive. He wasn't scrambling. He was in control. Fine. Time to turn up the heat. He leaned forward slightly, his voice steady but pointed. Jungkook, let's be honest. The idol industry has struggled with authenticity. A majority of fans reject the idea that idols have real creative control. When you speak, aren't you just preaching to a shrinking audience? The phrasing was deliberate. Back him into a corner, make him admit defeat. But again, Jungkook didn't hesitate. Minjun SSI, if we're being honest, then let's actually be honest, he shot back, his tone calm but firm. Fans aren't rejecting idols. They're rejecting a version of the industry that hasn't been properly explained to them. If all they ever hear is a media narrative that paints idols as puppets and companies as villains, of course they'll be skeptical. The problem isn't the music, it's the messengers. The way he delivered that last line, unshaken, deliberate, made Minjun shift in his seat. He wasn't just responding. He was taking control of the conversation. Still, Minjun wasn't ready to give up ground. Time to go personal. He glanced at his notes, then at the camera. Some have criticized your public image as being too polished, he said, his voice carrying an air of concern. You've made strong comments about the media, calling certain outlets biased. Do you think that kind of language helps bridge divides, or are you just feeding into the criticism that idols are out of touch? That was supposed to hit, make him sound extreme, make him backpedal. But he didn't. Instead, Jungkook let a small, knowing smile cross his lips. I find it interesting, Minjun SSI, that when idols call out bias in the media, it's labeled as defensive, he said, his voice steady. But when the media runs stories full of half-truths and anonymous sources, it's called investigative journalism. If people have lost trust in the press, maybe the press should take some responsibility for that. Minjun exhaled through his nose, just enough to steady himself. He had seen idols dodge, deflect, pivot, but this was different. Jungkook wasn't dodging. He was swinging back. The control room was quiet. No one dared interrupt the live broadcast. The tension between the two was almost palpable, and Minjun knew that audiences across the country were glued to their screens, waiting to see who would crack first. His earpiece crackled. One of the producers whispered a reminder, stay on offense. He nodded slightly, his eyes back on Jungkook. But this wasn't over. Minjun still had one more play, and this time, he wasn't holding back. Minjun could feel it now, the shift in power. This wasn't going according to plan. He had prepared to grill Jungkook, to push him into a defensive posture where he would stumble, fumble, or at least give him a soundbite that could be clipped and circulated. But Jungkook wasn't playing the role he had assigned him. His producer's voice crackled again in his earpiece. Tighten the grip. Push him. Fine. Time to abandon subtlety. He leaned in, adjusting his tone to something colder, more surgical. Jungkook, let's cut through the talking points. You've criticized the media for pushing a narrative, but isn't that exactly what you're doing? You present yourself as an independent artist, yet you're backed by one of the biggest entertainment companies in the industry. How is that any different from the system you claim to oppose? It was a direct attack, one meant to undermine his credibility. If Jungkook hesitated, even for a moment, Minjun could seize control of the conversation again. But Jungkook didn't flinch. He tilted his head slightly, as if he were sizing Minjun up. I'm glad you brought that up, Minjun SSI, he said, his voice steady, because it proves my point. When an idol is backed by a company, it's called being controlled. But when an independent artist gets support from major labels, it's called a breakthrough. It's fascinating how that works. Minjun felt his pulse tick up. He had another move, a riskier one. Since we're talking about narratives, he pressed, "You've been accused of pushing a carefully curated image, particularly regarding your authenticity and creative control. Would you like to clarify some of your previous claims?" This was his last-ditch effort. Throw a wide net and hope Jungkook got tangled in it. He needed a misstep, a fumble, anything to regain his footing. But instead, Jungkook let a moment of silence pass before answering. He didn't rush. He didn't stumble. What's interesting, Minjun SSI, is that you frame this as a curated image without specifying what exactly was fabricated, he said, locking eyes with him. That's what the media does. You take a broad accusation, repeat it often enough, and expect people to just accept it as fact. So tell me, what exactly did I say that was false? Minjun's jaw tightened just slightly, but enough. He knew what Jungkook was doing. He was forcing him to be specific, and the problem was Minjun hadn't actually prepared to debate details. His strategy had been to paint Jungkook with a broad brush, not to engage on the specifics. The seconds ticked by. The control room knew he was cornered. His producer's voice was in his ear again. Move on. Move on. He swallowed and forced a small smirk, trying to make it seem like he wasn't affected. Well, Jungkook, our viewers can judge for themselves. He said, a weak pivot, a retreat disguised as neutrality. But Jungkook had already won this round, and the audience knew it. Minjun could feel it now. He wasn't just losing control, he had already lost it. Jungkook sat across from him, completely composed, his confidence unshaken. The more Minjun tried to steer the conversation, the more Jungkook tightened his grip on the moment. And the worst part? The audience could see it. The live comment section was on fire. His producers were scrambling in his ear, throwing suggestions, but none of them mattered. He had to regain control himself, and there was only one way left to do it. He pivoted hard. Jungkook, let's talk about accountability, he said, straightening his posture. His voice took on a sharper edge, a last-ditch attempt at regaining his footing. You speak about media bias, yet idols are no strangers to carefully crafted images and PR strategies. Do you take responsibility for contributing to the perception that idols aren't authentic? Frame him as the problem. Make him justify himself that he watched closely, waiting for a sign of frustration, a tightening jaw, a flicker of annoyance, anything that showed he was getting to him. But Jungkook didn't take the bait. Instead, he exhaled softly, just enough to show he had been expecting this. That's an interesting question, Minjun SSI, he said, tilting his head slightly. Do you ask independent artists the same thing? Or does accountability only run one way? A pause. A long, deadly pause. Minjun felt the silence crushing on him. Jungkook hadn't just answered his question. He had flipped it back on him, exposing the exact bias Minjun was trying to deny. And worse, he had no way to wiggle out of it. He let out a small, controlled breath, but the damage was already done. The live chat was now brutal. People weren't just watching an interview, they were watching a demolition. Clips of the exchange were already spreading across social media, spreading faster than Minjun could recover. He had come in expecting an easy win. Instead, he had become the story. By the time the interview ended, Kim and Jun knew his moment of reckoning had arrived. The interview wrapped, but the tension in the studio remained thick. Minjun could hear his producer's voice buzzing frantically in his earpiece. We need to cut to break now. Too late. The second the camera lights switched off, the control room erupted into chaos. Staff scrambled to adjust feeds. A production assistant rushed over with notes that Minjun barely glanced at, and his co-host, seated off camera, just stared at him, wide-eyed. Jungkook, however, was unbothered. He stood up smoothly, adjusted his jacket, and gave a polite nod to the staff. "Thanks for having me," he said before walking off set, as if he had just finished a casual conversation. Minjun sat there, hands resting on the desk, his mind racing. He had lost, not just the debate, but the entire narrative. It wasn't just the way Jungkook had answered. It was the way people were reacting to it. The network had banked on this segment being an exposure piece, a takedown that would fuel talking points for the rest of the week. Instead, within minutes, clips were already going viral, but not in his favor. Social media was ablaze. Did this guy just get steamrolled on his own show? I don't even like idols, but Jungkook just humiliated this dude. The media always sets these traps, but this time the trap backfired. Minjun's face was everywhere, screen grabbed, memed, mocked. A slow-motion clip of him blinking in stunned silence was already making the rounds. Even some industry critics were calling out the failure. His phone buzzed, dozens of messages. Some from colleagues trying to spin the damage. Others from critics enjoying his downfall. But one stood out, a simple text from his network executive, "Call me now." And that's when it hit him. This wasn't just a bad interview. This was a career moment he might never live down. Minjun sat in his office, the door shut, the noise of a newsroom muffled but not distant enough. He could still hear people talking, whispers, hushed laughter, the occasional mention of his name. It was clear that everyone had seen it. His phone screen glowed with an onslaught of notifications. News outlets were picking up the story, not the one he had planned, but the one that had actually unfolded. Park Jungkook flips the script on mainstream media. Liberal journalist gotcha moment turns into a cell phone. Another example of media bias exposed in real time. And then there was the video. It was everywhere, not just a full interview, but clipped, edited, dissected from every angle. Some accounts had overlaid dramatic music. Others had added captions like "when the trap backfires." Even pundits from his own side were struggling to spin it. A few tried saying Jungkook dodged questions, that Minjun was just too polite, but no one was really buying it. He scrolled through Twitter. The top trend? His own name, Kim Minjun. Not for his reporting, not for his analysis, but for the moment he had lost control. He tossed his phone on the desk and exhaled. This was bigger than just one bad segment. This was a moment that exposed something deeper. For years, journalists like him had operated on a simple formula. Set the narrative, control the questions, shape the perception. It had worked before, but something had changed. The public wasn't as trusting as easily. They weren't just listening, they were watching, analyzing, catching the double standards in real time. And in this moment, Minjun had become an example of exactly what people were tired of, a knock at the door. One of the producers leaned in, looking cautious. "Minjun, they want you in the conference room." He already knew what the meeting was about, damage control. But deep down, Minjun wondered if it was already too late. He sat at the long, glass-topped conference table, surrounded by a room full of people who weren't there to support him. They were there to assess the damage. The executive at the head of the table, a man who rarely attended these meetings in person, leaned forward. "Minjun, let's be blunt. This was supposed to be a controlled segment. Instead, it turned into an unmitigated PR disaster. For you, for this network." Minjun knew better than to argue. He had spent his career on the other side of these conversations, dissecting public figures who fumbled under pressure. He understood the game. But knowing the playbook didn't make it any easier to stomach when it was being used against him. "We need a response," another exec chimed in. "Something that reframes the narrative before it completely runs away from us." Minjun rubbed his temples. "So what are we talking? A follow-up interview? A column?" The room fell silent. That's when it clicked. They weren't asking him how to fix it. They were deciding whether he was even worth fixing. One of the PR reps hesitated, glancing at the others before finally speaking. "We're considering putting someone else in your time slot for the rest of the week. Just to let things cool down." Let things cool down. Minjun swallowed hard. He knew what that meant. The polite first step in an eventual phase-out.